Okay, this is going to be a brief introduction to cells and the cell theory. So, biology is the study of all living things. Now, what's a living thing? Well, living things require energy. They grow, they reproduce, they respond to their environment, they have some type of lifespan, they produce weight, and they're made up of one or more cells. Which brings me to the cell theory. The cell theory states that all living things are made up of cells. Cells are the simplest unit that can carry out those life processes that I just mentioned, and all cells come from pre-existing cells. Now, all organisms are made up of different types of cells. Now, you can refer to figure 1 on page 29 of your textbook, but this is the breakdown of the main types of cells. So we have organisms here that do not have a nucleus. Generally, these are single-celled organisms. These are called prokaryote cells or prokaryotic cells. An example of these kind of cells are things like bacteria, like E. coli. They're very prehistoric, hence the prokaryote. Now, as cells evolved, they started to have nuclei and other membrane-bound organelles, and these more advanced cells are called eukaryotic cells. Now, an organism that's made up of eukaryotic cells could either be a single-celled organism, that is just one cell that completes all those life processes, but more often than not, it's a multicellular organism made up of many cells. Now, in this unit, we're going to be looking at both plant and animal cells. And we know plants and animals are made of multiple different types of cells, so they're multicellular organisms. Now, I mentioned eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and other membrane-bound organelles. So this is cell structures within the cell. So an organelle is a specialized part that carries out a specific function. For example, it could just bring in nutrients, it could just remove waste, it could generate or release energy for the cell to use, it can make substances the cell needs, or it's just specific for reproducing. Now, some organelles are common to both plants and animals. Some are specific to plants, some are specific to animals. So we're going to go over the common ones for both animal and plant cells. So you should make sure you have the handout, typical ant and typical plant cells, so that you could fill it in as we play the video. Now, if you don't happen to have this handout, don't worry, you can download the PDF in the materials section of Schoology. So we're going to start with the organelles that are common to both. So the first thing that's common to both plant and animal cells is cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is the jelly-like fluid that kind of helps give the cell structure. It's mainly filled with water, but it could be filled with other nutrients for the cell, and it just helps support all the other organelles. The next thing is the cell membrane. So on an animal cell, that's the very outer layer. On a plant cell, it's actually the second most outer layer, and that helps give the cell structure. Cell membranes are semi-permeable, so they only allow certain substances in and out of the cell. Next, we'll move on to this big organelle here, which is the nucleus. The nucleus contains all the genetic information, the DNA for the cell. It's kind of the brain or the operating center of the cell, and it tells the cell what processes to carry out and when to do them. Next, we have the mitochondria. They kind of look like angry jelly beans. This is where cellular respiration takes place. This is where energy is produced from sugar. And notice that plants have them too. Now we have the nucleolus. The nucleolus is referred to as the little nucleus, and it contains information about making ribosomes. Next, we have the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, the endoplasmic reticulum are these tubules that kind of progress from the nucleus out toward the cell. This is sort of the transport tubes within the cell to transport proteins and nutrients around. Now, endoplasmic reticulum, you can also shorten it to ER, can either be smooth ER, which is endoplasmic reticulum that doesn't have ribosomes, or rough ER, and that's endoplasmic reticulum that does have a ribosome. So what's a ribosome? Now, This is actually pointing to part of that endoplasmic reticulum and tiny little dots, which you probably can't see in this picture, but if we zoomed in on this picture, they'd be like those tiny little red dots here in the foreground. Each one of those is a ribosome. Ribosomes are really important in your cells because ribosomes are what actually create proteins. And everything in our body, in our cells, is made up of some kind of structure of proteins. So ribosomes make those protein chains. Now, Golgi bodies. Sometimes Golgi bodies are referred to as Golgi apparatus, and it looks like these stacked pancakes. So Golgi bodies are responsible for creating mucus, and they're for packaging stuff within the cell. Next, we have lysosomes. Now, if you think of cleaners at home, you might think of Lysol. Well, lysosomes are the cleaners of the cell. They help break down things that the cell doesn't want, maybe attacking bacteria. They help with cleaning up the cell. Next, we have a vacuole. Now, vacuoles are basically storage parts for the cell. The vacuoles contain mainly water. Now, if you notice, the animal cell vacuole is really tiny, and there's usually a few of them around the cell, whereas a plant vacuole generally tends to be one large vacuole. And that's because plants need to store a lot of water for photosynthesis, and plants don't have skeletal systems like animals do, and that water pressure actually within the cell helps give it the stability. If you've ever seen a plant that doesn't have enough water, it starts to droop, it starts to wilt, and that's because it's losing the water within the cell. So once you give it water, the pressure, that water pressure inside the vacuole helps give the plant the stability again to stand up. Next, we have the cytoskeleton, which both plant and animal cells, and it's fine microtubules that just help give the cells a little bit of structure. It can also act as like back roads around the cell to help stuff move around the cell. So these are all the organelles that are common to both plant and animal cells. Now let's just look at the ones that are specific for plants, which includes the cell wall, which is an extra thick outer membrane that's very waxy coating that helps keep water inside the cell. So again, they don't have the structures that or skeletal system that animal cells do, so they need that extra thick cell wall. When we look at plant cells under the microscope, it's actually the cell wall that you'll be able to see. Next, we have chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are these green organelles here. Chloroplasts are responsible for photosynthesis. This is where it takes sunlight and converts it into sugar. So cell wall, chloroplasts, and you could pretty much say that large vacuole are the ones that are specific to a plant cell. Now, the one that is specific to animal cells are centrioles. They kind of look like these macaroni noodles or Kraft Dinner. These are responsible during mitosis or cell division, which we're going to talk about in a couple of days. So those are all the different typical organelles that plant and animal cells have. What you should do is definitely make sure you can identify them, and you can play those games on Schoology that I've laid out there, and make sure that you know not only what they look like, but what they do.